Hi, thanks for having me. I'm trying to work out my slide sharing, but I will start talking, being fully mindful that I have to catch up some time. I'm going to talk about an issue where Austria is not on a front-running line, which is climate policy, and I want to talk a bit about the Müllner versus Austria case. It's a climate litigation case before the European Court of Human Rights. A case that I filed 3 months after Klimaseniorinnen. So it's actually been filed quite a while ago, but it's now sort of in process. It got granted priority status soon after the decision. We've had some legal observation exchange, and I'm expecting a judgment this year. So you put up the
Yeah,
presentation for
actually,
me.
I did. I found
You
it,
know
so
what? That's perfect.
I can step the slides for you.
Yeah, the slides are just a background sort of to keep you entertained, and I'll just continue talking. So, why do I think this case has been pushed back? I think it does make sense for two reasons. First of all, it will be the case where the court has to make a decision regarding individual victim status. What kind of individual can successfully sue a state based on human rights violation in the sphere of climate? And secondly, what makes this case quite interesting is the fact that Austria is a member of the European Union. And so now we have to deal with the interplay of European climate law, domestic law, and human rights law. You can put on the next slide. But yeah, just go through all the bullets. And let me maybe start with the facts that sort of at the core of this case. You see my client here, Mr. Müllner. Mr. Müllner suffers from something that's called the Utaf syndrome. What is it? It is a syndrome that makes the symptoms of his disease worsen with the increase in temperature. So he has multiple sclerosis. Officially, he would be called a disabled person because, in his case, the MS means that he has a lack of ability to move, but he can move, just not as sort of smoothly and fast as we do. But when it gets warmer, so on a sunny day when we go out swimming, he has to sit in a wheelchair. So the picture was taken in spring, not in summer. And when it gets really hot, he has to either sit in an electric wheelchair because he can't push the wheelchair by himself, or he is sort of isolated in his house. The interesting thing about him is that he's actually quite a well adapted individual. He's living in one of the coldest regions in Austria in a passive house. And yet in 2024, we've calculated that it was 2.7 months that he had to stay inside or sort of live a life as a fully disabled person. And so the fact that Austria doesn't even have a domestic regulatory framework in place makes him sue Austria because his symptoms of disease worsen because of climate crisis, and Austria is not doing its part. We have a climate act that is still in place but has run out of targets since 2021. We are also not on track to reach EU targets. And we don't have a procedural framework in place that would allow him to actually effectively file a case to make that claim. And so this case is very much about Article 8 and Article 13. So that's at the core. There is an Article 6 claim that has to do with sort of more procedural issues within the domestic procedure. But because that's not so much of international and European relevance, but more of domestic relevance, I'm going to leave that one out. And so the question that this sort of case poses, the first one is Müllner the first individual that can pass victim status? Can he show the pressing need of protection that is required? And for that reason, you can go to the next slide. We have worked quite closely with a lot of scientists. So we have medical statements that show that he suffers from Utrecht syndrome, and luckily, Austria doesn't challenge that fact. So this is a given in the proceeding already that he has this syndrome. The question is whether or not this is severe enough to pass the victim status. We have worked with climate scientists that provided us with a lot of data and modeling and projection on the numbers of days above 25 and above 30 degrees in his particular home region. And then we've also supported with a more sort of broader study that has been done by the University of Oxford and a consortium, an international one, that is looking at the impacts of heat for MS patients in Austria for different regions and sort of to see how that impacts their illnesses and their symptoms of disease, to whether actually really show whether that assumption that it gets worse only applies to his particular home region, or we're faced with a more sort of broader tendency here. So we've went into a lot of detail because so far no individual has passed that status because of the lack of documentation. So the court makes that door deliberately sort of small, and the question is it going to open or not? Personally, I wonder if the court is actually denying victim status to Mr. Müllner. I wonder who is able to pass it. And then maybe nobody is. Maybe that's also a way of dealing with it, to say it is a collective issue. This should be represented by NGOs where the court has been, opening up a very broad standing or not. I mean, the impact that it has in the long run is that as an individual, you're obviously more capable of filing damage claims. We haven't filed a damage claim because this is a strategic litigation intending to open doors, but obviously, if that passes, then you could have individuals who would kind of also request damages on top of regulatory changes. So that is the first big bulk of that case. The second big bulk is that Austria is saying, well, it doesn't really matter whether we have a Climate Protection Act and whether we have targets or what have you, because we are members of the EU, and the EU climate law and all that regulatory framework that is sort of attached to it, that suffices. That's enough to meet the standards set out by the court in Klimaseniorinnen. Now, the interesting thing here is that the EU's own scientific advisory board, the ESAB, has said that the EU is not on track to meet the 1.5 target. Now, in a way, that doesn't really come as a surprise because we're all reading the news and we know sort of 1.5 is out of the window, but yet that is the legal obligation on the the Convention of Human Rights set out by the court. And so the ESA wrote a couple of reports, and one of them is around the 2040 target. And there it said that even if the EU reduces 90 to 95% of emissions by 2040, it will still not meet the 1.5 target to the lowest level of fairness and has to offset. So the EU as such is not on track. However, from a strategic litigation perspective, I don't think it's very successful to go in all the way to say, well, the EU itself is not doing enough, because that would put the court in a very tricky position. I mean, being fully mindful of what is going on in the world and how the US is doing a completely different turn on things, and a lot of EU countries are more critical towards the rulings of the court when it comes to climate and environment. So the main argument put forward in the proceedings at the moment, all of them out there, but the main focus would be to try and establish that the court is saying, well, we do face here two complementary regimes. One is a collective regime of minimum standards by the EU, which is trying to set up, this is a bare minimum that the member states have to do according to our framework. It's a collective target. And the other one is the state individual obligation stemming from a human rights perspective. And these two are not in conflict. They complement each other quite well. And therefore, you can't really use the EU as a shield in a human rights litigation. So that is the main sort of tone that's running. Whereas, obviously, we are also talking about the finding of the ESAB report, and we are also talking a lot about budgets and targets. And that would bring me to my next slide. you have probably sort of followed, I'm sorry for this. It doesn't look like that on my screen, so please, it's not the best presentation, but um, if you follow sort of the latest decisions or advisory opinions in the climate human rights sphere, there's a lot of talk around budgets and pathways. They're still a bit mixed up in the Klimasenioren judgment. They talk once about a carbon budget and they talk about a pathway to climate neutrality.
Yeah, I can go get the print.
It's all good. Um, but what is sort of at the core on these, what is sort of the tone that you can take is that states are obliged to make calculations. And that these calculations are now very feasible and very doable. But what is still very much unclear is sort of which budget is feasible and fair, because the Paris Agreement does talk about different types of responsibilities for different states. And there is a lot of unclarity around it. And we tried to push the court to making some boundary statements on this. We'll see whether that happens, because obviously it does play a role on where do you draw the line. What you can derive from Klimasenioren is that it says even under an equal per capita approach would be the approach to say you take equals per capita for each state, and that would be the sort of the budget that they have. That is sort of the maybe the minimum amount of fairness, which is not fair if you really look at it from a historical responsibility, but that might be the way that the court is leaning toward. Now, if you look at the next slide, and thank you very much to my co-presenter, you can see that Austria is clearly not on track. Austria is on track to produce at least 3.6 times more emission than under the highest estimate of its equal per capita. Even with additional measures and to comply with EU set targets, Austria is not on track. I'm showing this to you because there's a lot of the graphs we also use in the observations to make it clear that, there is a ruling that needs to be made with regards to the relation of EU climate law and the European Convention of Human Rights. But it also plays into another element of this case, which is what do you ask from the court? And of course, you ask to say, well, to declare that there is an infringement on Article 8 and Article 8 and Article 13. But we also we also have requested general measures. Next slide, please. And that is has sort of happened in an environmental case in Italy recently. And this is also the line that now you can see the Board of Ministries is going with regards to the implementation of the Klimasenioren judgment. But it's really to say, you need to say more than there is a violation of Article 8, because these deficiencies are a systemic problem and Austria has already run out of its carbon budget. We've submitted to the court various carbon budgets calculations, and depending on the methodologies applied, it has either the carbon budget for 1.5 has either run out in 2025 or is about to run out like now. And that means because of that situation, the consequence is twofold. And that is you need to really order immediate reduction of emissions and general measures. And that will be the next slide. This is sort of what we requested the court to order. And this is an adaptation of the Klimasenioren, of what the court has found, but rather to sort of apply it and say, there needs to be a periodical update. There needs to be a bit more of sort of constant checking. And in addition to that, and that's a bit bold, and I'm not sure if the court is going to follow, but it's logical, and it's in line with the European Scientific Advisory Board to say, well, any exceedance of the national carbon budget, and that would be my last slide, has to be compensated through support of direct emission reduction outside the territory. Now, it's very unclear how that could work. It is obviously somewhere in the Paris Agreement that, that idea, And then there was a big question for us, are we going to expand on this idea or are we going to just drop it to the court that they start thinking, well, you have set an obligation for 1.5. This has run out in terms of scientifically possible to achieve that by reduction alone. What is the consequence to make that come alive or keep it alive, that 1.5 legal obligation? We've left it to the open. I'm not sure if the court is actually going to touch on it, but I think that's where we need to push further to really build on Klimasenioren and that very strong framework. And even if we don't succeed in expanding it on an individual level, to really keep these set of obligation and that framework alive, and especially to do that within the European Union. And that's that. Thank you so much for listening, and I apologize for my presentation and my lack for presentation skills, and thank you so much for co-presenting with me.
I can see that time is running, so I will try to shorten this talk. I don't have titles to share unless you mean my PhD with the Open University in the UK on the normative regulations of journalistic practice, which is actually relevant for what I'm going to talk about. The purpose of what I'm going to do in the next 8 minutes, if I see correctly.
Oh no! Don't limit yourself to 8 minutes. I think
I don't want to abuse
it wouldn't be
people.
fair for you to limit you. Please exceed the
Okay.
time limit.
Thank you. Anyway, I'll try to keep the time. I will try to demonstrate how public communication has functioned as the integral element that it is of strengthening right-based climate and energy governance within the Stellar project. This is in contrast to just using communication as a side element to the work we are doing or to the purpose of the entire project, which has been discussed at length by previous speakers. I actually thought it was a very good idea to speak last because what you heard by most of the previous speakers in a way exhausted the point I wanted to originally make, which was my first slide, that the work we are doing is positioned in the constitutional context for the European Union's structure of core values. And of course, the EU Charter for Fundamental Rights is the landmark, the benchmark of the project. But there are other structures which we have engaged, and this all brings us back to the set of EU core values which are enshrined in the Treaty of the European Union. I wanted to highlight that in practical terms, this means that decisions on climate targets, energy infrastructures, transition measures, and so on, cannot be treated as purely political or technical choices. These must respect the procedural guarantees, such as access to information, public participation, and access to justice. And if the standards are not respected, they can be challenged before national court of the Europe or the European courts. The energy transition operates with enforceable constitutional limits and not outside them. I think this is an important starting point when we are going to look how this displays into the communication environment, which we all operate in across Europe. But of course, I will be focusing mostly on the members of the Stellar project. Now, when I'm talking about, and this is my next slide, the communication challenges, I want to point two important features. First is a structural mismatch. Right-based climate and energy governance is legal, procedural, institution-focused, and complex, while the dominant communication environment which we operate in is generally commercially driven, platform-mediated, and attention-grabbing, and this creates a structural mismatch between the purposes of the legislation and the legal framework and the ability to ground it in the communication sphere. And a very important second element of this is the fact that commercial logic seems to shape the communication visibility of the issues we are discussing here. In a commercialized and digitalized communication ecosystem, there are some clear features which we need to consider, and we have considered when approaching this project and the work we've done in it. And these include that media revenue models are tied to traffic and engagement metrics. Platform algorithms prioritize content that generates strong emotional reactions and rapid interaction rather than understanding and analytical reflection. Detailed institutional or procedural analysis generally receives less visibility than sharp conflict-driven narratives. And an important issue which we've seen over the last 2 years very clearly internationally is that media owners, investors, the entire business ecosystem behind communication increasingly intervenes in shaping and limiting certain priorities and narratives on the field. Now, we've had to deal with all this. The last point I want to make here, and it's very essential for us as Bluelink, as an organization dealing with digital communication for over 25 years now, is that unlike traditional norm-bound watchdog journalism, which we used to be exposed to 10, 20 years ago, which has its own limitations, of course, the prevailing contemporary communication model is often structured around performance and ownership incentives, around business. It has no societal, democratic, or whatsoever normative commitment. So we cannot expect digital communication to serve any public interest purpose, democracy, and so on. Now, with all this in mind, what we have I will just jump a bit to the further in the direction is what we have designed as an approach. Bluelink's methodology traditionally, which we plugged into this project, involves working on a structural level rather than thematic. We work with journalists and communicators not about covering a given topic, such as human rights, law, climate enforcement, or other. We try to strengthen the public conditions under which citizens can understand and exercise their procedural rights in this particular case. And this involves building a supportive participation infrastructure, which requires public communication that makes decision-making processes, participation safeguards, and remedies visible and intelligible by a great part of the public. Now, how do we do this? Our method includes training journalists in procedural literacy and offering them access to information, public participation, access to justice, and knowledge of the legal frameworks that enshrine them. Direct engagement with civic defenders of climate, environment, and human rights, but also with litigators, legal experts, and decision makers to clarify the constitutional reasoning before participation. We do workshops and other formats that combine learning and production. So not only teaching, but also getting communicators to put their hands on the actual process of doing this complex task, and cross-border publication and amplification. We try to connect the different countries. And one very recent new development, which I'm tempted to share for a second, is that we are now trying to look more strategically at voluntarily self-regulating the way we, as civil society at least, use digital communication. So we need to be able to do it in a more responsible way if we expect the rest of the communication environment to become more supportive of the purposes of our work. Now, what did we do? It's stellar, and this is, I think, the more practical part. We tried to implement, to address the challenges I spoke about earlier. The principal approach included anchoring communication in concrete litigation cases, focused on procedural rights in energy governance, but placing it in the broader political and social context so that it could be linked to the interest and emotional, whatever, engagement of the audiences. Integrated the charter-based reasoning directly into storytelling and other communication practices that engage audiences, and address the digital communication pressures described earlier by adapting to formats and guidance in the implementation of the project. But the core principle is that we do not treat communication as dissemination. We treat it as an essential layer between legal enforcement and democratic participation. And I think this is a very key contribution of the project. The communication activities, I don't want to bother you much with them, but we did, you heard already in the beginning by Csaba, most of them. What I actually wanted to highlight and spend maybe the last 1 minute, because I'm already beyond midday, is the international workshop in Budapest. Now, I want to make a clarification that we keep calling it International Journalism Workshop, but an important element and step ahead with this workshop is that we brought for the first time digital communicators. We tried to see how the traditional approaches of training journalists based on their journalistic norms and ethical and professional requirements could relate to the new situation we're in, whereby no such requirements apply on the digital communication. What was really interesting is how the workshop, and here, oh, sorry, I'm going already to slide 5 now. Yeah, thank you, Csaba. No, I'm still back, sorry. The Budapest workshop operationalized the elements I spoke about earlier. The first and interesting example is the Hungarian Constitutional Court climate ruling, which I'm sorry we couldn't hear more about today, but it really changed the mind of many of us, participants and experts, about how litigation can actually operate in absolutely unexpected environments and, first of all, achieve effect. Second of all, become a really attractive field for storytelling. We connected this to the existing legislative follow-up in Hungary, or not existing. We'll see. Csaba can tell us what's going on with this new climate bill that is supposed to be developed as a result, but also a very outstanding institution, the Future Generations Ombudsman, which is really a benchmark for Hungary for the past decades. And then we had cases from Czechia and Poland, from Bulgaria on SLAPS, from Austria, and overview of the European Court for Human Rights. So we made sure that this group of European journalists and communicators could find the relevant hooks for their further work to achieve the task. And we performed the experts, the guest speakers performed case-based legal briefings. I have to say one of them was a Constitutional Court judge of Hungary who, I mean, it's not often that as a communicator you have the ability to speak directly to such a person. A direct dialogue between participating judges, litigators, officials, and reporters, structured story development sessions, and dedicated discussion. And one last point, that particularly in the structural session, we brought in a new co-moderator. Apart from my antiquated abilities and knowledge of traditional journalistic norms as a practitioner and a scientist, we also brought a younger lifestyle blogger, book author, and a digital communicator, Reka Nagy, who actually covered the new field, the new communication field. As a result, and that's the last slide on this one, thank you, Csaba, 36 participants, 14 countries, 20 publications, and cross-border amplification. My last, and I'm finishing here, my last slide is the lessons learned and recommendations. Lessons learned. Courts and litigation are providing strong narrative anchors. Its judicial decisions offer clear institutional reference point, and they help structure complex energy debates. So that is an important thing for communicators and journalists alike. Legislative follow-up is also important wherever that exists. That makes the stories more attractive and the audience is more interested in what's going to happen. Comparative perspectives strengthen legitimacy. So comparing different member states, national dispute situations, and we already have such stories published as a result of the project, including on national television. That is really, I think, encouraging. Mixed communication cultures can collaborate effectively, meaning structured interaction between norm-bound journalism and digital communication. Production commitment ensures impact, requires concrete publication outputs, transforms training into a measurable cross-border media result. And the final lesson learned, as I mentioned, good practices may emerge in the most unexpected context. We have member states perceived as lagging in EU implementation sometimes, but exactly there we find really encouraging cases. So we should be always open for good practices. And the recommendations are different target groups. Legal practitioners should present litigation as enforcement of institutional duties and clarify procedural standards and consequences. Human rights and environmental defenders, our primary stakeholder group, should systematically document participation and access to information failures and connect cases to the EU Charter guarantees and other EU law. And we heard much better arguments for this earlier. Media and advocacy support organizations and donors need to combine training and theoretical teaching with publication pipelines and structured dialogue between journalists and legal experts. And finally, regulators and decision makers, where possible, need to treat participation and access to justice as core components of energy governance and ensure accelerated measures remain charter compliant. But this is, of course, and this is my final word, in case they and we all abide and want to abide to the EU core values and purposes that I started with and that underlies Stellar's project implementation. Thank you very much for your time and patience.